As part of the event series Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, sponsored by the Vienna-based International Peace Foundation, we're pleased to have with us this evening Dr. Karan Singh for a discussion on interfaith dialogue as a pathway towards peace. Dr. Singh is an Indian political icon, an environmentalist, a former cabinet minister, a state president, member of parliament, and ambassador. In 1949, at the age of 18, he was appointed regent and Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir. He was elected president of Jammu and Kashmir, a post he held for 18 years, and in 1967 was elected to the Lok Sabha, the lower house of the Indian Parliament, where he has remained as an MP ever since. He was made a cabinet minister by Indira Gandhi, holding the first tourism and civil aviation portfolio, and later holding the health and family, planning, and education and culture portfolios. Dr. Singh was appointed Indian ambassador to the United States in 1989 and is now chancellor of the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University and a member of the advisory board of the International Peace Foundation. He's also published poetry, essays, fiction, and an autobiography. So without further introduction, please join me in welcoming Dr. Singh.
Thank you. Thank you, President, Vice President, and members of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. As you've just been told, I'm here at the invitation of the International Peace Foundation. Uwe Murowitz, the moving spirit, is here. My wife and I arrived a couple of days ago. I shall be speaking at the Chulalongkorn University tomorrow and day after tomorrow at the Khon Kaen University. My theme this time is, incidentally, this is a part of a whole series of lectures that the foundation has organized. I'm one of the few speakers who has not yet received a Nobel Prize. The theme that I'm working around is the importance of the interfaith movement. The interfaith movement, as all of you know, is a movement designed to bring together in a harmonious dialogue people representing different religious traditions and different sects within religions. In modern times, perhaps you could say the first event was in 1893 in Chicago, where the first Parliament of the World's Religions was held. It was a very significant event at that time, at the end of the 19th century. And in the 20th century, a large number of events were held. There are half a dozen major interfaith organizations around the world. One of them, the Temple of Understanding, I happen to chair worldwide. And we've had a whole series of events in Moscow, in Oxford, and so on. The second parliament was held in Chicago again in 1993, exactly 100 years later. The third was held in Cape Town, South Africa. And the fourth is going to be held in Barcelona, Spain this year, in July. There was an event also in the United Nations in the year 2000. Now, the whole point of this movement is not either to have a theological debate with regard to the merits or demerits of any particular religion, or to debate the superiority or otherwise of these religions. The basic theory is this, that unless there is interreligious harmony, the whole concept of a peaceful and sane world is never going to be achieved. Religion has had very great achievements down through the centuries. Much that is great and noble in human civilization, art and architecture and dance and music and scriptures and a whole gamut of artifacts can be traced back to one or the other great religions of the world. On the other hand, perhaps more people have been killed and tortured and massacred and persecuted in the name of religion than in any other name. So there is this dichotomous record of religions. And what we feel is that as we are moving now willy-nilly, impelled by science and technology, into the global society, we have to overcome the narrow, fundamentalist, fanatical approaches of religion and we have to spread the message of interfaith understanding. That is the basic theme, and my presentation is going to revolve around, tomorrow is going to revolve around how that can be done, what are the several dimensions of peace, and how we can achieve that. That is a brief overview of what I'm going to say. I have no intention of delivering that lecture here, so don't look so worried. I'm now game. Actually, I'm open to questions, and then perhaps as we go along through the evening, we can expound on some of the other points. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm at your disposal.
Okay, why don't we open the floor for questions? Please identify yourself before you ask a question, and we'd like you to refrain from making statements and stick with concise questions. Thanks. Any questions to start off with?
Yes, sir.
There's a microphone just back here if you want to use that.
I really can commend you for your lucidity. It's pretty rare. I have a very great concern, as you have very well articulated, of what's going on, between the religions and stuff. And the religions not only just have their theosophical and theological aspects to them, but there's socioeconomic considerations. And I have a very, very strong concern that part of what's going on at the present time between the Muslim, entity and the governments and such is this socioeconomic aspect of the Muslim religion. It seems as if it is got a parallel with the socialist, with the communist, with the labor kind of movements, which have effectively been suppressed. And I'm wondering if this is maybe not the next rung on the ladder, and if you have anything to comment about that.
As you know, India has the second largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia. We have 125 million Muslims in India. And the whole interaction between the Hindus and the Muslims over the last 1,000 years is a very mixed and somewhat painful history. What I would say is this, that yes, there is a lot of economic deprivation among the Muslim masses. However, I don't think that can justify the sort of Taliban type fanaticism and fundamentalism that developed in Afghanistan first, then in other parts of the Muslim world. It seems to me that it would be wrong to suggest that the entire Muslim community has become fanaticized, as it were. There are lots of different shades within the Muslim community, but the jihadi mindset, the Taliban mindset, is indeed an extremely dangerous and very disturbing phenomenon. It has to be met on two levels. One, of course, violence cannot be tolerated and has to be repulsed and repressed. On the other hand, it is true that Muslim societies are largely deprived and underprivileged. And if we can develop, if those societies or those nations can start developing economically, then perhaps much of the rough edge of Muslim fanaticism may rub off. Meanwhile, we have to be very, very concerned. India has been the target of Muslim fundamentalism for the last 15 years. The world simply woke up to it after 9/11, which was a horrific thing. We watched it all on television, incidentally. I do not know whether you did, but we actually saw it happening on television. It was a horrific event. The Windows on the World was my favorite restaurant in New York, and it was terrible to see those beautiful buildings collapse. That is a very powerful symbol of the fact that there are elements in Muslim society who are deeply against any type of democratization or harmony. That said, I think we must also in all fairness say that there are elements in the Islamic society who oppose this, and that we can only hope that it doesn't, like in the 20th century, Nazism rose and fell, Marxism, Leninism rose and fell before our very eyes. Perhaps Muslim fundamentalism will also fall, hopefully, and we will move on to a more rational development. That is my hope.
Next question.
I'm Costas Paris from Dow Jones. Dr. Singh, do you think that the recent rapprochement between India and Pakistan is a serious thing? Is it going to lead to lasting peace, or is it going to break down?
I think that the recent meeting in Islamabad, the SAARC meeting, was an extremely positive development. Having followed these events literally all my life, I find that there is a new sense of realism both in India and in Pakistan. I think we realize that if we are going to expend all our energies fighting each other, then we are not going to be able to break the poverty barrier. As it is, 30% of our populations live on or below the poverty line. And vast resources are going into defense, and there is a lack of rapport, a lack of economic development and so on. Now, the Vajpayee-Musharraf meeting was an extremely positive event. I feel that this is not simply yet another failed event. I feel that this does mark the opening of several windows of opportunity. The bus services have started, rail services have started, air services have started, and very importantly, President Musharraf has said that he was not going to allow either Pakistan territory or the territory of Jammu and Kashmir under his control to be used for terrorist purposes against India. So it seems to me that we have reached, I wouldn't say that yet there has been a breakthrough, but the preconditions for a breakthrough, I think, are now there. And all men and women of goodwill, hopefully, will try and push this process along in the year ahead.
Other questions? Yeah, Brennan? Oh.
Hi, I'm Brennan Jones. I wanted to ask you a question. I'm a New Yorker. If you had 10 minutes with George Bush, what would you say to him about his own projection of religion in his foreign policy? And what would you tell him about your own agenda in terms of the dialogue?
In the unlikely, well, not so unlikely, I presented my credentials to Papa, so there's no reason why I shouldn't have 10 minutes with the son. But if I did have 10 minutes, I would spend the first 5 asking him to sit quietly and meditate. I think that will do everybody a lot of good. And in the next 5 minutes, I would try and explain to him that the age of the empires has now passed. United States is a great country. I've known it for half a century. It's a great country built upon the foundations of idealism. And we grew up with the speeches of Abraham Lincoln, and FDR was our model, our hero of my generation, and later Kennedy. And I would try and urge him that the United States, while safeguarding its own interests, must realize that they cannot ride roughshod over other countries. And I would hope that he develops, unlikely though that might seem, the qualities of compassion and understanding even in the 4th year of his presidency.
Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy Kasman from the Financial Times. I wanted to ask you, you expressed concern about different kinds of fundamentalism. I'd like to inquire about your assessment of the prospects for Hindu fundamentalism in India. There has been a lot of concern about Hinduization and saffronization of Indian politics, and I want to hear your assessment of how far the BJP is planning to go in this direction, and what the prospects are for this.
Yes. Well, it is true that fundamentalism has really touched almost all religions. Islam certainly, Hinduism certainly, Christianity perhaps, Buddhism perhaps to a lesser extent. Surprisingly, the BJP today as a party represents a very moderate version of Hinduism. The really virulent, shall we say, the really extreme modes of Hinduism are represented by the Bajrang Dal and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad and so on. It is a disturbing situation because India, although we were partitioned on the basis of religion in 1947, and Pakistan was set up overtly on the basis of religion. What the rest of India did was that we adopted a constitution, and not only which was not Hindu, but which was entirely secular and which built in special provisions for the religious minorities. And so we've been very proud of our democracy for the last 55 years. And any lurch towards fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism, to my mind would be disastrous for our country and for our democracy. Therefore, you are right, there is a tendency in that direction. There have also been some very ugly incidents, particularly the terrible affair in Gujarat a year or two ago, which is really a shame and a disgrace for us. But I do feel that we have in the last half century and before that we have developed a strong enough democratic fiber, as it were, to resist and overcome fundamentalisms. In fact, you will notice that the BJP has had to jettison several of its more extreme or more radical proposals in order to come back into power last time. It put them on the back burner. And I think the same will happen now in the elections that are now due in the next 2 or 3 months. I am hopeful that the democratic system itself, the great advantage in India is you have democracy, and therefore you are able to, people are able to express their views. And many of the other societies we were talking about earlier, particularly most of the Islamic societies, they lack democracy. And where there's no democracy, their fundamentalism is much easier to grow because there's no way people can express their views and all. So I am hopeful, I am aware of the dangers, but I am hopeful that we'll be able to overcome them.
As a follow-up, could I ask you whether you think that the Congress Party has done enough to defend Indian secularism, or whether they have also kind of allowed a kind of a more radical strain by sort of offering a soft saffron in order to compete with the BJP's?
No, I don't think that is true. The Congress Party has always been committed to secularism, but that does not mean that the Congress Party should be anti-Hindu. After all, you know, if 94% of people in Thailand are Buddhists, 82% of people in India are Hindus. And therefore, obviously, the Hindu civilizational values and symbols will have an important place in our national life. But no, but I do think that the Congress probably should be a little more active now. We are all gearing up for the fray, and let's see what happens in April.
Any more questions from the floor? Others?
My name is Karan, and I would like to ask Karan.
Oh, good.
Karan Singh also.
Good.
Aliwal, actually.
I have a namesake.
And I would like to ask one question. That is, last election you fought against Atal Bihari Vajpayee.
Yes.
Do you think the coming election also you will be contesting against Atal Bihari Vajpayee?
No, I think now Atalji deserves a weaker candidate. Yes, well, first of all, the state, you know, is really the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Kashmir is a shorthand for a state built up by my ancestors called Jammu and Kashmir. It is a pluralistic, multi-regional state, Kashmir being one of the 5 sort of ethnic or linguistic groups, geographical groups, areas in that state. There has been a dispute over this state, as you know, from 1947. After the Shimla Agreement in 1972, it was decided that there would be bilateral talks between India and Pakistan. It has taken a long time, over 30 years. But I do feel that with the latest developments in Islamabad, with the agreement between India and Pakistan there, to start a composite dialogue, which would include Jammu and Kashmir and several other outstanding issues, yes, there is hope that they will come to some kind of settlement.
How might that happen? Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
No.
Could I ask, sorry, Alex Spillis, Daily Telegraph, as a follow-up to that, how do you see Kashmir's future as an independent state, an autonomous part of India? In your view, what should it be? What would be happiest for Kashmir?
I would rather not express any view on the final settlement, the final settlement of the state, for obvious reasons. I'm not only a detached political observer, I'm also deeply involved in the history of that state. In fact, it was my father who signed the instrument of accession to India in October 1947. Therefore, I would not like to say anything about the final outcome. I would simply like to reiterate the hope that there will be talks and that there will be a mutually acceptable agreement. Yes, sir, again.
Yes. These violent, attacks and stuff that have been happening with the terrorists and things, do you feel that if we were able to provide some kind of a venue so that they could address their grievances, is there part of this violence because there is not the opportunity to address their real felt grievances in the matter? And what kind of a vehicle might we come up with to get this out of the attack into, yes, trying to resolve the underlying causes of these things rather than just dealing with the symptoms?
Well, there are several fora where these grievances, as you call them, could be raised. The United Nations is one of them, although it's not terribly effective. Bilateral relations, because there are a number of Muslim nations involved. And bilaterally, there is also the Arab League, again, which is not very effective, but which could theoretically become a forum where these issues could be addressed. I agree with your basic concept that it is important that these issues are brought out on the table and discussed rather than pushed under the carpet there to fester and then to explode in violence. This is really something which the Muslim nations themselves have to work out. As far as India is concerned, of course, we have, as I said, democratic systems. But in West Asia particularly, I think it is very important that there should be fora where these matters are discussed, the Western world and the Arab world. We belong to neither, but their conflicts can really keep the world in turmoil. And therefore we have a vested interest in some kind of a rapprochement or settlement in West Asia also.
Other questions? Anyone? What do you think? I mean, the events of the past few years have obviously polarized the world along religious lines in a way that, I mean, what steps can world leaders take at this point to address religious issues while, maintaining their roles as political leaders, heads of state, and so on, in addressing issues of faith?
I see your point. It is a difficult one because political leaders do not generally like to get involved in issues of faith unless you have religious leaders. That is where the interfaith movement, the gathering together of religious leaders, youth movements between countries, and service units, Rotary Lions, and so on, they can all help to build a climate of understanding between the religions. It's not something that the political leadership can do on its own. That is where the media particularly, if I may say so, you see, we had 6,000 people in Cape Town, and not a word in Time or Newsweek or anywhere except in local newspapers. Now, if there's a communal clash somewhere, there's a headline. This reminds me of a story I must tell you. I knew a person called Tarzi Vitachi. You may have heard of him. He was a very famous Sri Lankan journalist. And he told me a story once that he said, there was this American producer who had discovered a new girl, an actress. And he went to his friend who was a genius in media. And he said, Jack, I want you to get her photograph on the front page of every newspaper in America. Can you do it? He said, yes, I can do it. What do I have to do? He said, shoot her. So the point is that the media, if I may say so very respectfully, if somebody gets shot, it's headlines. if 5,000 people get together for inter-religious meeting, nobody bothers about it. So maybe you could also help us in that. Movement, yes. Well, the secular world, you see, it is really a semantic problem. I don't think the secular world necessarily means people who are not interested in religion. I mean, I happen to be, I've written on Hinduism, I've lectured on Hinduism around the world. But I look upon myself as secular in the sense that I respect all religions. And if I come here, I wouldn't dream of leaving without going to the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. Or if I went to Rome, I wouldn't dream with leaving without going to St. Peter's. Because in the Hindu tradition, the divinity is all pervasive. And wherever there are these great religious centers, there it is incumbent upon us to pay our respect. So the secular world, if you're talking of the non-believers, I'm not quite sure what you mean by the secular world, because yes. Well, let me tell you about secular fundamentalists. For example, the Marxist-Leninists. Some years ago, my wife and I went to Moscow at the invitation of Mr. Khrushchev. And he gave a party for us in the Kremlin, a small party. And I asked him at that time, I said, Mr. General Secretary, is it possible in your country to be a believer as well as a member of the CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union? He said, no. He said, we respect religious faiths, but to be a member of the CPSU, you have to be atheist. Now, there is what you may call fundamental secularists, 70 years of brainwashing, 3 generations. And the moment that structure collapses, there is an upsurge of religion. I went there again in 1990. The churches were full. The icons were being repainted. There was a tremendous upsurge of Christianity. They were celebrating the 1000th year of the advent of Christianity. Let me give you an example from Mongolia. The Leninist, Marxist-Leninists destroyed the Buddhist temples, killed the monks, burnt the scriptures. The moment that they collapsed, the first thing they wanted back was their religion. So we had to send bhikshus from India in order to re-establish Buddhism in Mongolia. So religion appeals to something very deep in the human psyche. And I think that there may be certain fundamental atheists, shall we say, but I think generally there is not so much now, with the collapse of Marxism, Leninism, it's not so much a conflict between the secularists and the religious people as between religious people intercede. And also, as came out in today's dialogue, intra-religious. For example, in the Islamic world, the Shias and the Sunnis are deadly. In Northern Ireland, the Catholics and the Protestants are locked in deadly combat, and so on. So this is a multiplicity, a variety of conflicts. But I think generally the principle is to move towards pluralism, to move towards harmony, to move towards, if I were to ask what is the key concept of the interfaith movement, I would say to accept the multiplicity of paths to the divine. No religion can claim the monopoly of divine wisdom. Who are we, tiny creatures, residents of a tiny speck of dust in the cosmos? There are billions of suns in our galaxy. There are billions of galaxies in the universe around us. How do we know where consciousness has developed and in what way? And we turn around and say that the divine can appear, the illimitable splendor of the divine can appear only at this place and only in this time and only in this form. It's prima facie unacceptable. So I think we've got to move above these. We can certainly say, you could say, this is my faith and I feel this is the best path to the divine. Fair enough. But you cannot therefore say that somebody who doesn't follow your faith, you can kill him or maim and so on. So the acceptance of multiple paths to the divine is the essence of the interfaith movement. And the sooner religious leaders accept and understand and welcome that, the better for all concerned. On that cheerful note, shall we end? What do you think? Anything else?
Any other questions? Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Within modern Hinduism, which representative of modern Hinduism do you think epitomizes this multiple, I can't remember exactly your term, your multiple paths to the divine. Within modern Hinduism, which is the best representative of this ethos?
He's seated in front of you. It's me. It's me. I'm serious. It's me. In modern Hinduism, it is me. I mean, I travel around India and around the world lecturing on Hinduism and on the universal concepts of Hinduism. My book on Hinduism is taught in the universities, and I do think that I represent. I'm not a religious leader. I'm a secular person. I'm not a religious leader. But as a Hindu, as somebody who studied Hinduism, I think that I do represent. There are lots of others, mind you, also. I'm not pretending to a monopoly, but the fact of the matter is there are people. There are many sects. I can go into various names and so on. But yes, we are doing that. Modesty is not among my many virtues, as you can see. Yeah, somebody there.
Another question?
Yes, going back to the earlier question about the secular and the spiritual interface. In the case of Tibet, you have the Dalai Lama, who's a great spiritual leader, and also a political leader, and who's been pursuing a path of non-violence for settling the Tibet issue. But for many years, that seems to have produced no resolution at all. How do you see that issue?
Just last week, I was presiding over a lecture by the Dalai Lama. I've known him now for many, many years. He's a very fine human being, and he's a great religious leader. And he has made it clear that, as I understand him, that he's not asking for an independent Tibet. What he wants is genuine autonomy for Tibet within China. And he is pursuing his goal. He does say that there are younger people who are getting restive, but I think he realizes that there is no realistic option but to accept the fact that China, it will remain part of China, but to try to maintain, strengthen and sustain the Tibetan culture. And he is very clear on that. I think I have great respect for the Dalai Lama. I met him when I was 21, he was 16. Chu Enlai had come to Delhi, and Chu Enlai in fact introduced me to the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama both to me at that time. And I have followed his career ever since he's come to India now 40 years ago. And he's a remarkable man. The way he has shepherded and led and husbanded the Tibetan diaspora is unique. All over the world there are Tibetan communities who are flourishing because of the guidance provided by the Dalai Lama. He's really a rare human being, and one can only hope that his moderate position, the middle path that he has adopted, sooner or later will bring about a transformation. I asked him about it last week when we met. He said he felt that gradually China was also changing. The Marxism-Leninism of China, if it collapsed in the Soviet Union, they were also changing. And once the Chinese changed their attitude, perhaps that would be the way in which the Tibetan problem would finally be solved.
A last question? Anyone? All right, well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank our guest this evening, Dr. Karan Singh, for joining us. And please join me in thanking him. Also, I wanted to remind you that one other event coming up at the club, we have on January 30th our annual general meeting. We'll be electing the board for this year, so please join us to cast your vote. And you don't have to be foreign, you don't have to be a correspondent to join the Foreign Correspondents Club, so consider joining if you're not already a member. Thanks.